This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 174 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's transactions, I wanted to let you guys know about FanDuel's free-to-enter Gridiron Pick'em. Just choose the winning teams for all of Sunday's games with no spreads and compete for a chance to win $10,000 split amongst all of the top pickers. $10,000 is up for grabs for free every week, so be sure to head over to FanDuel.com and check it out. Sell David Johnson. Johnson was featured on this podcast as a sell candidate after week 2, but at the time, we had far less information than we do today. Back then, Sam Bradford was still the quarterback, and we didn't know how long that would continue. And we also didn't know how long they'd continue down this path of running so few plays offensively. Since that time, Arizona made the move to Josh Rosen, but the problem is they've gone from 50.5 offensive plays run per game to 48.7. And that's hurt David Johnson's ceiling. Now, his fantasy point totals haven't been all that bad. Johnson's actually a low-end RB1 in cumulative PPR points scored at the position after 5 weeks. But how he's accumulating those points is not sustainable in this type of offense. He has 242 rushing yards, and based on the rushing yards to rushing touchdowns rate that we've seen by running backs over the last half decade, Johnson's rushing touchdown total should be between 1 and 2. Instead, he has 4 touchdowns. This is not like a Todd Gurley situation where his team is consistently putting him in plus situations. Arizona has run the fewest plays in the league this year, and that even includes teams who have had their bye. No team has run fewer red zone plays than the Arizona Cardinals, and even with Josh Rosen under center over the last 2 weeks, the Cardinals have still averaged the 3rd fewest yards per drive in the entire league. And here's the thing, we also haven't seen much of a change in David Johnson's receiving usage since the first couple of games either. His average depth of target has jumped slightly to 1.3, but it's still far off from his 4.7 mark a couple of seasons ago when he really had a huge year. And in Josh Rosen's 2 starts, David Johnson's target share has dropped from about a 17.2% share to a 13.5% share. Now, the Cardinals' offense can and hopefully will improve as the season goes on, and that'll make David Johnson a little bit more viable. But this is also a time to sell because he's clearly overachieving in the touchdown column to start the season, and a lot of fantasy owners may not realize that. Buy the Cincinnati passing attack. Another transaction that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is to add Andy Dalton, mostly because of his upcoming schedule. And now that the Bengals had a mediocre outing offensively in week 5, fire off some offers. Get pieces to this passing attack, whether it's AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, Andy Dalton, maybe even Joe Mixon. And the reason for that, as I said, is the team's schedule. Upcoming for Cincinnati are contests against the Steelers, Chiefs, Buccaneers, and Saints. Those are all very, very beatable secondaries, and the over-under in those games should be high. We're already seeing that this week with the Steelers and Bengals opening with a 54-point game total. And 3 of those 4 games that I just mentioned will be played in Cincinnati. You're going to want pieces of the Cincinnati passing attack over the next month. Drop Chris Hogan. All right, guys, give me the L. Hand over that L. I was wrong about Chris Hogan this year. It was a mistake to draft Chris Hogan. He's been horrific for fantasy football purposes. He's playing lots and lots of snaps for New England, but he's secured just a 10.6% target share. And now he's got more competition for targets incoming with Julian Edelman back from his suspension and Josh Gordon sort of getting acclimated to this Patriots offense. There might be big weeks for Chris Hogan, but those big weeks will not be predictable. You can drop him. Add Philadelphia Eagles running backs. Jay Ajayi was put on IR on Monday, which opens up the Philadelphia backfield a bit because he was averaging over 11 attempts per game. The problem is there's no clear-cut player set to take on a much larger workload in his absence. Corey Clement's been dealing with a quad injury, and meanwhile Wendell Smallwood has stepped up and he actually played as many snaps as Jay Ajayi did on Sunday. But then there's Darren Sproles who's been nursing a hamstring injury, and even Josh Adams. But Josh Adams hasn't been all that involved even with all these running back injuries. And the team could also add a running back. So what should you do? Who should you add? Corey Clement would be my pick, but not very confidently. If we look at how the Eagles sort of viewed the depth chart before things got messy, Clement was clearly ahead of Wendell Smallwood to start the year. He was third in snaps behind Ajayi and Sproles in week 1, and then he led the backfield in snap share in weeks 2 and 3. And then as he's been banged up over the last 2 weeks, Wendell Smallwood has sort of emerged. So to me, both Clement and Smallwood should be added, as should Darren Sproles. But the most likely scenario is that we're going to see a running back by committee in Philadelphia. That is, unless they trade for a running back. Add Keke Coutee. So Coutee's being highlighted for a second straight week on this show because his ownership percentage didn't rise enough after his big week 4 performance. He's still only owned in 34% of Yahoo leagues and 20% of ESPN.com leagues. On Sunday night, Coutee hauled in 6 of his 7 targets for 51 yards and a score. He's now been on the receiving end of 22 of 86 Houston attempts over the last 2 weeks. That's good for a 25.6% target share. Keke Coutee is filling the underneath role in that Texans offense, and they've desperately needed that. He should have a high floor week in and week out in PPR formats. Drop Rashad Penny. The Seattle Seahawks have made it pretty clear that Rashad Penny is not going to be a big part of their 2018 plan, or at least not right now. Over the last 3 weeks, Penny's played 14.5%, 24.2%, and 0% of Seattle's snaps. That's right, the Seahawks' first-round pick played behind Chris Carson and Mike Davis on Sunday. He didn't find the field once, so go ahead and drop him. Buy the Cleveland passing attack. So similar to Cincinnati, the Cleveland Browns find themselves in a really great spot fantasy-wise as well over the next month or so, at least from a passing perspective. Week 6 features a game against an underperforming Chargers secondary, but that's also the toughest matchup that they'll face until the end of November. Because after the Chargers, they get the Bucks, Steelers, Chiefs, and Falcons. It's a similar schedule to Cincinnati because they play in the same division and they face similar opponents. But it's a schedule that should really help the Cleveland Browns passing attack. So if you need a quarterback streamer, add Baker Mayfield. If you want a legitimate wide receiver 1, trade for Jarvis Landry. If you want a plug and play tight end, trade for David Njoku. Buy the Browns passing attack. Add Josh Reynolds. So both Cooper Kupp and Brandon Cooks were knocked out of Sunday's game against the Seahawks with concussions. If they miss time, Josh Reynolds is going to step in. He's the next man up. When he stepped in against the Seahawks on Sunday, he caught 2 of his 3 targets for 39 yards. And meanwhile, the Rams have used 3 wide sets at the highest rate in football this year, meaning Reynolds should see volume if one of those 2 wide receivers is out. So he's worth an add, especially if you've got Cooper Kupp or Brandon Cooks. Sell Russell Wilson. If you started Russell Wilson in week 5, you're a very fortunate fantasy owner. Because a 3-touchdown performance on a sub-200-yard passing day is not very common in football. In fact, Wilson's week 5 performance was the first of its kind this year, and it's something that occurred just 4 times between weeks 1 and 16 during the 2017 season. Russell Wilson now has a 7% touchdown rate this year. That's 1.3% higher than his career average. So touchdown regression is going to come through the air. That's the first knock on Russell Wilson. But the second, and honestly the more important one, is that Russell Wilson is not running the football that much. Last season, Wilson averaged nearly 6 rushing attempts per game, and he added about 4.8 fantasy points per contest via the ground. This year, he's running the ball just 2.2 times per contest, and he's adding only 0.8 fantasy points per game with his legs. That's not a good sign. Now, things can change, but at a position as deep as quarterback, there's no reason to buy into that change. There's no need to buy into Russell Wilson right now. Buy Emmanuel Sanders. Now, it's really hard to buy players, especially wide receivers, who are in offenses with bad quarterbacks. So this particular transaction to buy Emmanuel Sanders is risky. But here's why it's interesting. He's seen a 22.9% target share in Denver's offense this year. There's nothing wrong with that. And he's also going to see advantageous matchups given he's playing 61.3% of his snaps from the slot. And after not seeing a single red zone target through the first 4 weeks of 2018, Emmanuel Sanders ended up with 4 in week 5. That's a positive sign. That's especially a positive sign for a guy who's underperformed in the touchdown column this year. Probably the top reason that I like Emmanuel Sanders as a buy, though, is his schedule. He should naturally have a decent floor each week given his usage, but Denver's upcoming matchups include games against the Rams, Cardinals, Chiefs, Texans, Chargers, and Steelers. The Broncos could be forced to throw a lot in the majority of those games. That'll help Sanders see a little more volume as long as he maintains his current target share, which I think is a pretty reasonable ask. So like I said, this is not totally safe. But after another average outing for Sanders where he didn't score, I don't think it's a bad idea to offer something up to the team who has him. Buy Marshawn Lynch. I've been very open on this podcast in that I'm not really a fan of rostering running backs who can be game scripted out of contests. And that's exactly what you're getting with Marshawn Lynch. And we saw that on full display on Sunday as the team opted to play Jalen Richard when the game flow got really, really bad against the Chargers. Rashard ended up playing 50% of Oakland's snaps, while Marshawn Lynch was on the field for 40.4% of them. The Raiders have now played 2 games where they've just gotten blown out. But in the other 3, Marshawn Lynch played 54.3%, 55.3%, and 63.1% of the team's snaps. And in those matchups, Marshawn Lynch carried the ball an average of 19 times with 3 targets per game. He saw really strong usage when games were close. Now, I bring this up because Oakland's playing at home in 2 of their next 4 contests, with their true road game being against a 1-win San Francisco 49ers team. They'll get the Seahawks in London this week, where Seattle's only a 3-point favorite, and then they get the Colts at home in a plus matchup, and then they get the 49ers, who I just mentioned. Now, the Raiders have a bye week after their Week 6 game in London, but you could also use that in negotiation when trying to acquire Marshawn Lynch. And I'm not saying to break the bank. He's an RB2 in a world where there's a large gap between the true RB1s and the rest of the running back position. He's just got a pretty favorable October and early November, and he's coming off a down game. That's why he's a buy. Add Jameis Winston. So Winston's still available in 80% of Yahoo leagues, probably because everyone has a quarterback because the position is so freaking deep. And even if he doesn't become a plug-and-play starter, you can use him this week against the Falcons. That Falcons-Buccaneers game has a 57.5 point over-under. There will be scoring. And Atlanta's been a very good matchup for opposing quarterbacks this year, having allowed a 20-plus point performance to every quarterback they've faced who's not named Nick Foles. Jameis Winston is easily the top streamer here in Week 6. Buy Julio Jones. I feel like this was inevitable. A buy Julio Jones transaction was bound to happen, given he still hasn't found the end zone. Excluding the playoffs, Jones has scored just 3 times in his last 21 games. We know that's the biggest reason he's not ranked higher in fantasy football right now. But there's just so much going for him that we just can't ignore. He's got a 29% target share this season, which is one of the highest marks in the league, and he's captured 48% of Atlanta's air yards. That's the number 1 air yard target share in football. He has a 15.1 average depth of target, which is one of the better marks in the league, and that combined with his target share is what makes him a truly elite asset in fantasy football. But I get it. He's not scoring touchdowns. He only has 3 red zone targets this season. That's the same number as teammate Mohamed Sanu and 2 fewer than rookie Calvin Ridley. Now that's going to limit his upside in fantasy football. Even though his receiving yardage total tells us that he should have between 3 and 4 scores by now, or at least players with his total historically have seen that many touchdowns, we also know that context is important. And context is saying that Jones isn't some premier red zone threat. We know this. But here's the thing. The fact that Jones is a fringe wide receiver 1 in PPR formats right now, despite not having a touchdown, is absolutely insane. Had he found the end zone just once this year, he'd be a top 6 fantasy football wide receiver. At this point, touchdowns are almost icing on the cake. And I do think that touchdowns will come. Maybe not in bunches, maybe not at the rate that we see from someone like Antonio Brown or other elite wide receivers, but they should come. And they could come as soon as this week against Tampa Bay, who he scored twice against last year. It's just worth talking to the Julio Jones manager in your league. See where they're valuing him. Because given his usage, he should still be valued as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football from here on out. Add Cameron Brate. So with OJ Howard looking like he'll miss a couple of weeks with a sprained MCL, Cameron Brate makes for a great tight end option. I mentioned this last week on the show, but the 2 tight ends were sort of digging into each other's workloads in the Tampa Bay offense, with Brate running 78 routes this year versus Howard 77. That's all according to Pro Football Focus. Now, heading into Week 5, those numbers ranked around 30th at the tight end position, so nothing special. Howard being sidelined, though, should allow Brate to run more routes. And in what should be a high-scoring affair in Atlanta this weekend, Brate makes for a top streaming option at the position. Add the Dallas Cowboys defense. So the Packers should be added this week as a top streamer, but they're owned in about half of leagues. So they might not be available in yours, but they're in a great matchup against San Francisco. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, you could look at Dallas. The Cowboys are hosting Blake Bortles and the Jaguars, and we know that any defense facing Blake Bortles has a lot of upside. And over the last 3 weeks, each defense to face the Jags has ranked as top 10 options in fantasy football. And that includes Kansas City, a unit that's been struggling all season long. The game between the Jags and the Cowboys have a low over-under, so there should be a nice floor for Dallas. It's a tough week for defensive streamers, but I really don't mind the Cowboys. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in the 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to buy Keenan Allen. Allen's usage really hasn't been that bad this year. He's He's got a solid 26% target share, and he's seen about 26% of the team's air yards. You wish that air yard number was a little bit higher, but his average depth of target has been lower than last year at 7.5. That might limit his upside a bit if you're wanting him to do what he did in 2017. But he's still been underperforming in the touchdown column, and he still has a floor that's been fine in PPR formats. We know there's lots of upside with Keenan Allen. He's giving you a floor, and we know a ceiling can come. So I think that he's a good buy right now. That's going to be it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.